Hi guys, welcome to Monitoring and Evaluation Made Simple. I'm your host, Coach Alexander. I'm so glad you've joined me for this course. And this is the June edition. I released one course earlier this year and it's getting a lot of views. But this course I've released in June is special because at the end of this course, there's going to be a special gift I'm giving to all my fans. It is a free ebook, a monitoring and evaluation guide that will teach you step by step on how to do M&D activities and more especially how to develop an M&D plan. So this is the outline of this course. It's quite long actually. So what I've done is that in the description I've put some timestamps so that in case you don't want to watch the first part of this video, you can just skip some parts of this video and go to the place where you want to actually derive answers to your questions. So as you can see, my outline is as follows. Of course, I'm going to start by talking a bit about the M&D guide. If you don't want to hear about the M&D guide, you can just use the timestamp in the description below and skip that part and go to wherever you feel you want to get information. So this is the outline. The first part is the M&D guide. Second is what is monitoring, what is evaluation, what is an indicator, types of indicators, guidelines when selecting indicators. Then I'll also jump into explaining the types of data sources, data quality and use, how monitoring and evaluation is done, 6 steps. Okay. Now you may not know this. Some people out there, they are actually practicing M&E, but they don't really know how to do the monitoring and evaluation, or at least they don't do it the right way. So in this last part of this course, in this section, I'm going to show you how it's done in 6 steps, the absolutely correct way. Okay, then I'm going to give you the link again on where you can get this M&D guide. So I'm so glad you've joined me. Let's get straight into it. Okay, I think I went a bit too okay. Okay, so maybe I'll start by explaining what is monitoring. Well, monitoring, dear friend, is a continuous process in which you are collecting information, you are tracking activities in order to ensure that they are going in the best way possible. They are being implemented according to the plan as set out in the project strategy, project document, and this activity is done on a regular basis throughout the project cycle. So the purpose is simply that when you're doing monitoring, you want to ensure that it's really doing what it was designed to do. And what I'm saying here is that as activities are being implemented, you want to ensure that those activities are being implemented the right way and they're according to plan and the budget is being used appropriately. So this is the stage whereby you're able to determine whether indeed so things are being done according to plan. So I have written something about the stakeholders. You see, we have many stakeholders. We have the donors, we've got the employers, we've got the communities, and we even have the implementers themselves. So these have a key interest in the progress of the project, especially the donors, because these are the ones who pump in a lot of money. So they deserve to know exactly how their money is being spent. If you've noticed around the world, the donors funding seems to be shrinking a lot, and especially because we are in this COVID-19 pandemic. If they are to fund you during this period, they'll even be more aggressive to know how their money is being spent, because if their money is not being spent the right way, they might as well take it to bettering the lives of their own people in their own country. So the whole purpose is that we want to be accountable when we do this monitoring. So monitoring is sometimes referred to as a process evaluation because it focuses on the implementation of processes. I'm sure you understand what a process is. Take for instance, if you are, let's say you have a project, you are trying to, I always like using the example of poverty reduction. So you are trying to reduce the poverty levels of a certain community. So in order to do that, there are a lot of activities that you may be engaging in, such as training these community members how to be entrepreneurs, also giving them access to finance. So those activities, the process of having those activities implemented is what you're actually monitoring. So let's say for you to undertake a training, what do you need to do? In most cases, you need to first of all acquire the funds, all right? You need to acquire the instruments. And when we say instruments, we're talking about maybe it could be flip charts, it could be a projector, it could be fellows facilitators, a vehicle, all those things. So now the process of acquiring those things is what is monitored. Also, the process of how you're going to actually do the training, where you're going to do the training, is what is also being monitored. So the whole issue is that you're just trying to track. You're trying to track and see whether indeed these processes are being followed. And that's where sometimes people tend to confuse monitoring with an audit because really audits are looking at compliance. And in a way, when it comes to handling of funds, you're always going to run into a point whereby you ask people whether they acquired the funds the right way and they spent it the right way according to procedures. So the issue is, how well has the program been implemented? Okay. How much does implementation vary from site to site? For big projects, you may have different implementation sites. So the whole issue is, how is the variation? If at all there's any variation, then you're also asking yourself, if this variation is quite distinct, it's quite big, the question is why? So that's what monitoring does. It asks the why, it answers the why question. It also answers when, how, all those questions are being answered when we do monitoring. Did the program benefit the intended people? At what cost? So all those questions are being answered during the monitoring. So there are so many examples that are being, when you go around the world, this is what is actually being monitored. Okay, supply inventories, like I talked about. If you are supplying, let's say, quality seed to community members so that they can grow their crops, what are the processes? Have the processes been handled the right way? Did the right quantity of seed reach the communities? What was the quality of service? Okay, of course, quality is not easy to measure, and we all know why it's not easy to measure, because it's dependent really on how somebody feels. You may ask somebody today, how do you feel the project, how do you feel the quality of the project provision has been, the implementation of the project, how would you rate it? Others may rate it differently depending on their mood. Okay, so this is what they call qualitative data. Service coverage, patient outcomes, all these are notable examples of variables that are being monitored. Now, speaking of variables, you have to understand that, and I'll explain this as we go on, that there is no way you can monitor a project without knowing the indicators. So I'm going to talk about this as we proceed further. So monitoring, as I mentioned earlier on, it's counting, continuous tracking, collecting. That's what monitoring is all about. And it's done throughout the project cycle. It starts when the project implementation starts and ends when the project implementation ends. Unlike evaluation, an evaluation can be conducted even after the project has ended. An evaluation can be conducted, and that is what you call an impact evaluation. So we'll talk about those things after these slides. So it's really continuous and it's throughout the project cycle, as I earlier pointed out. But it's really important to understand that even as you are doing these monitoring interventions, if you are going to say that there has been progress in the implementation of activities, the key question stakeholders will ask is compared to what? So the right way to report on M&D results is to always compare it to the before situation. And that is why you need to collect baseline data. And this is always done at inception of the project. I've seen organizations not do this. It's quite surprising, but they're still able to report, which isn't right because they don't have a baseline. So it's always good to have a baseline so that you know what you're reporting against, and it's easy to communicate to people that indeed there has been substantial progress in the implementation of activities. So another thing is that when you're doing the monitoring, and this is why it's really important to monitor projects. When you're doing the monitoring, things can go wrong. So it's always important to use this this activity to be able to correct on the mistakes. Even as the project is running, you can still correct on the mistakes. Take for instance, if you are driving your car and you notice that the gas is running out. So what do you do? I mean, you've noticed that you're monitoring the gauge and you've seen that gas is running out. The next thing you do is go to a filling station and refuel. So monitoring is like an early warning system. It helps you determine whether indeed you're on track and you're doing the things correctly. Okay, so what is evaluation? I usually like to define this in my own words, okay? But I've already given you the definition there. But really, evaluation is an in-depth assessment to determine whether change has happened against the planned objectives. I talked about the impact evaluation. What is the impact evaluation? Well, it measures the difference really. But you see, I always, I've been dealing with this for 10 years, guys. If you are watching this video, I've been dealing with this for 10 years. So most of these definitions, even as I have written them in front of you right now, they're at the back of my head. Because impact evaluation, it's saying the difference in the outcome of interest between having or not having. Yes, that is impact evaluation. But I can tell you that in my own words, it's simply change, whether change has happened as planned. And this impact is what is known as the long-term change. And this is where I was talking about even when the project finishes, you can do an impact evaluation 5 years later to see whether this project had any impact at all. So evaluation requires data collection. Okay, I want to mention this to you. I probably didn't write it in this slide, but a baseline is a kind of evaluation as well. It is known as a formative evaluation. Okay, so now when you do these evaluations, it is really critical that you collect the data. This data could be primary data or it could be secondary data, but it has to be collected. Unlike evaluations, yeah? Oh, no, I put that wrong. Actually, unlike monitoring, evaluations are done only at specific points in time. Okay? So you do it perhaps at the beginning of the project or program, midway through the program or project, and at the end or after. Okay? So it's quite interesting because this evaluation is what is actually going to tell you whether there has been any impact from this project. So it gets exciting because sometimes you may want to put aside, of course, you have the people that you were servicing, that you were empowering in the communities through the project. Okay? But then you have those who were not actually receiving any support. So those who were not receiving support are what are known as the control group. But I usually don't want to always give examples give examples on community-based project interventions. Projects can even come in the form of the roads that are built all over the country, the roads that are constructed, the houses, the buildings, all those are projects which are done by engineers. So M&E is cross-cutting. For as long as there's a project, then you can do M&E activities. So once this evaluation is done, decision makers will understand whether indeed there was any impact. But it's not just the decision makers, because when we talk of decision makers, we're talking of the donors, we're talking of the government agencies, ministries, but it doesn't always have to be them really who are affected, who want to know, even the other stakeholders. Even the project beneficiaries themselves are interested to know these findings. So it's really critical that at the end of an evaluation, you answer the question the way it is. Because in many cases, if you say that you want to determine whether whether the project has positively contributed to poverty reduction in a community, that's exactly what you should conclude. It should either be it has not achieved its intended purpose or not. But you know what I see with many of these reports from consultants? They want to put in so much detail that you don't even know how to conclude. A conclusion should go straight to the point. And then, in the conclusion, the first paragraph can be straight to the point. Then you justify in the subsequent paragraphs. Then you offer recommendations. That's how a good evaluation should be. Okay. So what is an indicator? An indicator is a variable that measures one aspect of a program or project that is directly related to the program's objectives. So really, an indicator is the means to measure change. Always have it in the back of your mind that what we are really doing is trying to measure change. And the only way you're going to do that is if you know exactly what you're looking for. There are so many examples of indicators. And if you look at my YouTube channel, I always talk about key performance indicators. But the truth of the matter is that these indicators are developed by the project team. Okay? So they don't need to be similar with any, even these United Nations indicators you have, the Sustainable Development Goals. They don't need to be exactly the same. Okay, you can contextualize your indicators to your own setting, but the point is that they should be smart, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. So you see, with indicators, the change can either be positive or negative. Take for instance, if you want to measure whether farmers in a certain community are empowered, are financially empowered, what indicator do you think you'll use? You probably will use an indicator that measures the level of income per month of that farmer. So what that indicator will tell you is that, let's say you go in the field, you are doing an evaluation, you go in the field, you interview a farmer, and that farmer tells you that my income at baseline was $500. But after 2 years, my income has increased to $1,000. What does that tell you? It means there's impact. And it has impacted, this project has impacted on them in a positive way. But it's not always like that. It's not always rosy when it comes to implementation of activities. Unfortunately, that is what a lot of programs want to paint to donors, to stakeholders, that everything is rosy. There is no harm if things are not doing so fine, because that way you're able to learn. Because this farmer at baseline, let's say his baseline income was $500, but after the 2 years, it falls to $200. The question is why? And when you establish the why question, then you'll be able to draw good conclusions. So an indicator is a measurement. It measures the value of the change, whether positive or negative. It can have its own units of measurement. Let's say if you want to know the weight of a crop, that is measured in kgs. If you want to know the income of a farmer, it's measured in dollars, US dollars. So the whole point is that you need to be able to determine where is the situation, where was it before, and where is it likely to go to. So now indicators focus on certain aspects of a project. So what this is telling you is that in a project, you may have different things you want to achieve. You want improved livelihoods of farmers. And on top of that, you also want more women being empowered. Okay. On top of that, you want also more children being secure and having access to meals, 3 meals a day. So now what this is telling you is that for each of those themes, there has to be indicators. And when you use the indicators the right way, can you best be able to determine whether indeed there's progress or not? So now, it's usually recommended that you have one or two indicators per result. I've seen projects have so many indicators. I'm not a fan of that. And the reason is simple. When you go in the field to collect this information, it can prove really expensive. And analyzing it is even more expensive because it takes more time. You need the right software, you need the right personnel, and most importantly, how do you interpret all this information? So it's usually good to keep things simple, and if you want, you can collect additional information, but it shouldn't confuse you because at the end of the day, you want to draw the right conclusions, you want to make the right decisions. So you just try by all means to keep it simple. And that's why, on this YouTube channel, everything is simple if you've noticed. There are two types of indicators that you need to be fully aware of. You've got the quantitative, you've got the qualitative indicators. I talked about this briefly. So what is a quantitative indicator? As the name suggests, these are indicators that you can easily quantify. You can easily count. Let's say, for instance, level of income of a farmer. Isn't it easy to establish the level of income of a farmer? The reason is that all you need to do is ask them for if they have a salary pay slip. Usually farmers may not have that, but they could be recording their income somewhere. So you just go to their books. If it's a business, you go to their business books, look at the numbers and calculate the income per month. But when it comes to qualitative indicators, it's really difficult because these are indicators that are based on perception. So take for instance, if you want to know how happy farmers are in a community, is it easy to quantify happiness? It's not easy. And because it's a perception, happiness is a perception, it's dependent on how a person may feel on that specific day. It's not easy to quantify, but they are there. These are the indicators that I personally have used in the last 10 years of M&D. So why are indicators important? All right. Indicators are so important and it cannot be overly emphasized. If you don't have indicators, how are you going to measure change? And one of the things you also need to realize is that indicators should be properly developed. Because if they're not properly developed, at the end of the day, you can't be able to report clearly what you should have been reporting correctly. So they are basically there to help us measure, to help us gauge. If you're ever going to be able to measure progress, it's because you have indicators well defined. So a good indicator should have the following characteristics. Okay? Produce the same results each time it is used to measure the same condition or event. Measure only the condition or event it is intended to measure. Reflect changes in the state or condition over time. Represent reasonable measurement course. Be defined in clear and ambiguous terms. But most of all, indicators should be smart, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. That's how indicators should be. And you must be really careful when it comes to formulating smart indicators because sometimes you enter an organization and the project has already been approved, and when you look at that project document, the approved indicators are so difficult to understand. It has happened before. And that is why it's always important at planning stage, people should involve M&D personnel who understand these things better. Indicators should be consistent with international standards and other reporting requirements. This I totally agree 100%. If you've noticed, the United Nations has its sustainable development goals and have many indicators that they've communicated to the world. So it's always a good idea to harmonize. Okay, you streamline some of your indicators to global trends or even to the national strategy of a nation. Because look at it this way, most of these implementing organizations, these non-governmental organizations, are simply there to supplement government efforts. Because government can get constrained sometimes, so they need to supplement the efforts by government. And imagine if they're doing that, but without also streamlining what they are doing to the national agenda. So it's always good, even as you are planning, make sure you cross-check what is the nation trying to achieve and compare it with what you as a organization want to achieve. And also another thing is that when you do that, you'll find that linkages with these decision makers will be strengthened because they know that you are cooperating partners working together for the same objective. Indicators should be independent, meaning that they are non-directional and can vary in any direction. What this is meaning is that in some of these projects, especially some of the projects I've read, you'll find that in the documents they are saying, let's say they want to reduce poverty, they are saying reduction in poverty by 50%. Is that an indicator? You might say it's an indicator, but the truth of the matter is that it has not been properly formulated. You are not supposed to give any direction as to where the indicator should go. You should not say decreased in poverty reduction by 50%. You simply just say level of poverty levels. And the reason is simple because in many of these projects, poverty can be either positive or negative. And that's how indicators behave. They can either be positive, they can either go negative, depending on how the project has been implemented and also external factors. Indicators should be easy to interpret and explain. Very important, my friend. We need to simplify the way we do things. If an indicator is difficult to interpret, I can guarantee you that even the reports will be quite difficult to understand and read. I've seen this happen a lot of times. A report will be developed, and then once it's presented to stakeholders will ask questions to the writer of that report. And that writer is failing to answer his own content. And the reason is simple, especially on the findings. If he didn't fully understand what he was doing, he can't answer fully any of the questions that are being posed to him. So it's in order to cure that, it's important to make sure your indicators are well formulated. So now the indicators should be well linked to frameworks. All right. I want to talk about briefly the M&D framework. You see, the M&D framework is well linked to indicators. I've given an example of family planning. You've got a family planning project. So the results are that increased availability of quality service. Okay, that's one result. Then increasing demand for the service. All right. So those are the results. Okay. So now in those results, in your M&D framework, you have to make sure that these results are clearly distinct and it is easy to understand how you're going to get information on these results. Hence, you need to link these indicators to the framework because the M&D framework is going to tell you how you're going to collect this information, who is going to collect this information, analyze it, and report on it. Now, this is an interesting one. What are the guidelines in selecting indicators? Okay, I talked about SMART, but let's look at some of these other points. So now you need to select indicators requiring data that can realistically be collected. I talked about this in the previous slide. There are so many times I've seen this problem come up. You have an organization that wants to collect over 100 indicators and you ask them, how are you going to collect it when you don't have enough funds to collect it? And even if they do have the funds, how much time is it going to take to collect? Because by the time you're generating a report, you would have missed a quarter. So ideally, it is good to select one or two indicators. I think I'll go for two actually, because then you're simplifying things. If the worst gets to the worst, you can even have 4 indicators per result. But the point is that you don't want to overburden yourselves when the time comes to actually feed this information into a centralized system. Because if you are so ambitious, you will not be able to foresee that this can actually fail. And it's really sad when donors have pumped in a lot of money and then they are not seeing the results of their hard work. It's important we pay attention to these things. Okay, so now you can select no more than 8 to 10 indicators per area of significant program focus. Okay, so what this is telling us is that you can go an extra mile depending on the focus area that you're trying to measure. So it's always good, if you're going to go that route, make sure you've actually outlined indicators that are going to add value to the understanding of whether there is progress or not. It's good to use a different mix of data collection sources. There are basically two ways you can collect data. You've got the primary way where you do one-on-one interviews with respondents. But then you've got the secondary data collection where you're just simply using literature which was already done many years ago. Okay? So it's always encouraged to use both these two methods because it helps in better understanding the results that you've reported on. Okay, so now let's look at the types of data sources. We've got different types of data sources used to obtain data for M&D activities. You've got the client, you've got the program, you've got the service environment, geographical levels, and so on and so forth. But all this is trying to tell you guys is that these sources of information can come anywhere. But among the many challenges that you may face, if you are collecting data, because they all present their own challenges, if you are collecting data straight from the client, you need to think about how well they are, whether the information they're giving you is valid, is correct. But it's not really a problem at that level. But the problem comes in when you're getting this information from a different source. You were not involved in the collection of data, you just find a report ready. It could be a report in the library, it could be a report online. So it's good to use credible sources of information all the time. So routine data sources, maybe let me explain what routine data is. Routine data is that data you collect frequently. Okay, so for instance, when it comes to trainings, let's say you are training community members on how to become entrepreneurs. So like when it comes to training, maybe these trainings are done monthly. So because you are doing these trainings monthly, it means that you'll be collecting this data monthly. So it could be the number of people who attended those trainings. You'll be collecting that monthly and it's regular. So that's why they call it routine data. But there's data that is only collected at specific points in time. You can only collect that data once a year. Let's say production of commodities on the farm. That can only be done once a year because crops only get harvested in most cases once a year. Okay? So routine data sources can be anything from registers or even the tools you use to do one-on-one interviews with farmers or with community members. Okay? Non-routine data, like I mentioned earlier on, this is collected on a non-periodic basis, usually annually, and it's less frequent. And it's not because that's how it's been intended, but it's just a situation. I gave you the example of the crops productivity. This only happens once a year. So indeed, so it goes the same with such kind of data. I told you this course would be long, so if you're tired, please look at the timestamps. You can click on the timestamps and get to any question or part of this course that you would like to listen to. So that timestamp actually helps you to skip videos wherever possible. So please do likewise. Okay, so now data collection. When it comes to data collection, you have the M&D plan, which will tell you exactly how the data collection is done. I've got a video on this YouTube channel that talks about the M&D plan. So you do well to watch those videos. It's a very important document. So it gives you the when this data should be collected. It gives you where the sources, where this data can be found, the timing, frequency, who is responsible, and also where it's feeding into. Very important, because if you're going to just be collecting data and it's not feeding to any indicator on the project document, then simply stop collecting that data. But if it's doing something significant to the project, then you can continue collecting it. There is no harm at all. So throughout the data collection process, quality is very important. And maybe I need to touch on this a bit longer. When we say quality, what do we really mean? Well, data quality, we are simply saying that it's of a required standard. Okay? We all have our standards, personal standards, international standards. So, what is the standard of data in a certain organization? If it meets that standard, then it's of high quality. All right. So now what this is telling us is that in order to maintain data quality in accordance to the prescribed standards, you need to do monitoring. Okay. But it goes even deep because this quality we're talking about should be dictated from different M&D policies, plans, procedures in the organization. And that is why it's important to have these documents in place. So what do we really mean when we say of high quality? We need to remember that one, I talked about the sources of this data. Are these data sources credible? And then was the right method in collecting this data, was it done the right way? That's a question you need to ask yourself. Were we using the right tools? If we were doing all those, then the data is of high quality. Also, it should be free of errors. Do you know that having too many errors really messes up things? So we need to ensure that when we collect this data, it needs to be free of errors, and then it should meet the expectations of the stakeholders. Okay? So there are different ways you can, as an M&D officers, there are different things you can do in an organization to ensure that the data quality is maintained. And one of those things is conducting a systems audit that can help a lot in understanding the data quality levels in an organization. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, let's go further. So types of errors or biases common in data collection. We've got the sampling bias occurs when the sample taken to represent population values is not a representative sample. I've seen this happen a lot during my time. And you see, guys, unfortunately, you may come across this, especially if your team members don't fully understand why it's important to follow certain procedures and standards when undertaking M&D activities. So it's always important to have a representative sample when doing M&E. That cannot be overemphasized. So let's say your population is 2 million community members. Are you telling me you're going to, out of those 2 million community members, you're just going to interview 50 people and you call that a representative sample? The answer is no, that is not a representative sample. At least out of those 2 million, we should get 10% to interview. So now 10% of 2 million, I'm sure you know it's 200,000. So when you look at such a big figure, people tend to get get agitated because to do that it will cost time, money, a lot of resources. But that is just standard practice. You need a representative sample or else it will be difficult to interpret your findings. Non-sampling error or other kinds of mismeasurements such as courtesy biasness, incomplete records, or non-response rates. I've seen all of these errors before, and I can tell you it can be really disruptive to your research, to your M&D activity, and even in drawing conclusions, you'll be at a store. Okay, let's continue. Okay, so the data quality, we need to ensure that we need to cover all areas of interest. Okay, that's the when we talk about the coverage, we need to ensure that all the indicators are collected. And remember, the indicators are found in the strategic plan. So you have to ensure that even as you're collecting this data, it is feeding into all the indicators. It should be complete, it should be accurate. Frequency of data collection should be according to the prescribed plan, okay, of data collection. We shouldn't be skipping the plan when it's required to collect the data collection. When it's required to collect data, do it according to plan. Report on time, report according to the schedule. Okay, so all these help in making sure that the data is of a required standard. So when we talk about data, we are simply talking about the information that you collect. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but if you want, you can reverse this video and try to analyze these 4 points. Okay, it's important that maybe I want to touch just briefly on the fourth point. M&D data need to be manageable and timely, reliable, specific to the activities in question. Okay, so don't make the mistake of collecting data that is not answering any question, because I can tell you that will be disaster. So we need to make sure that this data is well linked. When decision makers see this information on their table, they can make informed decisions based on what you fed them. And this is one thing you need to remember, guys. When it comes to these M&D reports, you need to speak the truth. You need to speak what is actually on the ground, because when decision makers immediately they get this report, they'll be relying on what you are feeding them to make decisions. But some of them, you might not realize it, but some of them, even if the report is lengthy, but they read every page. And if they have question marks, if they have doubts, they might even ask you to explain further. They might even want to validate what is coming out in your report. Now you can imagine if you were rushing through things, your data wasn't of high quality. Imagine what that would even mean for your job if it's found that there's a huge discrepancy. So you have to make sure that everything is up to standard. All right. So now, how is monitoring and evaluation done? This is by far the most important part of this monitoring and evaluation course for June 2020. So the first step is that you need to undertake a desk review. Okay, before I go any further, these steps I'm giving you today can be applied even if you have no clue of what you're going to do as an M&D officer in that organization. If somebody if an organization recruits you to work as M&D officer, these are the steps you should follow if you want to undertake M&D activities. So you first do a desk review. You read the project plan. You read the strategic plan, project document. Mind you, all these documents I'm speaking about, they are totally different, but they all speak the same language. You read through them, and then after you read through them, identify the key performance indicators. What I've noticed is that sometimes a project document may be difficult to understand. So if I face such a problem, I'll go straight to the logical framework, look at the indicators, and then I'll have an idea what I need to be collecting. Now, in the event there are no key performance indicators, unfortunately, you may need to develop them yourself. You may need to call upon a meeting and try to help your team or help your employers understand that in order for you to do the job, you need to have these key performance indicators. So you have to agree on what those indicators will be. And in such situations, it can get messy because now you have to be talking about the baseline. You need to find out whether indeed there was a baseline conducted. If no baseline was conducted, then that's another problem. But now let's just assume you've identified the key performance indicators. So now, after you identify the key performance indicators, you develop the data collection tools. These are the instruments you use to collect the information that you're looking for, to collect the numbers that you're looking for. So after you develop the data collection tools, the step 4 is to undertake the actual data collection intervention. So remember I told you there are two types of data. You've got the primary data, you've got the secondary data. Okay. So you need to make sure that whether you're collecting primary or secondary, you're using the tools, okay, that you developed. And each of these tools should be answering or should be well linked to the key performance indicators. So after you collect the data, you can undertake data entry, data analysis, and report writing. So when doing the data entry, I've seen some people use Excel software. You can also use SPSS to do the data entries. You can also use these softwares to do the data analysis and finally the report writing. So after you've done this, submit the report to the stakeholders. So whichever channels that have been, if they whatever channels are in an organization, follow those channels when it comes to submitting a report. But what is key is when you submit your first draft, make sure you get as many comments as possible from the stakeholders, and you make sure that for all those comments, tackle each and every comment and resubmit, and then the report will be approved. So I sure hope you enjoyed this course. It has been long, I know, but that's why we have the timestamps in the description. I hope you made good use of them. As I earlier mentioned, I have developed an M&D guide for 2020. Please do well to download that guide. It's in the link in the description. It's a very important guide that I want you to use as you do your monitoring and evaluation activities. I've been your host, Coach Alexander. Until we meet again, see you on the other side. Bye.